the like. And
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it just, I say, look at what you see in the mirror rather than looking around.
so, thank you very much for joining us, Grégoire Roos. You have written a fantastic essay for the summer issue of The World Today, which describes in, I'm going to say, rousing and upbeat terms how Europe can fashion a new role for itself in whatever direction the world order might be going. And strikingly, you start by considering the paintings of the great Romantic painter, artist, Caspar David Friedrich. Here we have an image of Wanderer above the Sea of Fog. Now, many might say, well, yes, Europe, in contemplating its fiscal, political, and defence challenges, is indeed contemplating an abyss. But you see this painting in much more kind of positive terms. I wonder if you could describe that for us.
I've always loved that painting, and if one puts oneself in that man's shoes, there might be a few things passing through his head, but one might be, will I wait for the clouds to dissipate themselves and fade away? So there's a kind of optimism in that picture that, interestingly enough, was painted in 1818, if I'm not mistaken, right after the Napoleonic War. So, Europe found itself grappling with that post-Napoleonic reconstruction. It was a tough time geopolitically.
Mhm.
And at the same time, the progress of the Industrial Revolution was providing many across Europe with a bright prospect of more prosperity. Back then, the discussion was about political liberalism, so more participation of everyone, at least men back then, in society. And there are definite parallels with our times, I found.
But he might see Europe as constantly trying to catch up geopolitically with the US on one hand and China on the other. But you write that Europe should not attempt to mimic these superpowers in asserting itself, only in terms of hard power. You say its opportunity to recover relevance and purpose lie elsewhere. I wonder if you could describe that.
The US will never be Europe. China will never be the US. And I think Europe's I don't think it's explicit, but there's this sort of unconscious, perhaps, uh, feeling of inferiority that would make us push us to try to constantly feeling ashamed of lagging behind them, doubling down on trying to resemble them, look like them, from the economic perspective, socially, the way we even structure our public discussion. I think it's fine to be European. And just because something is working elsewhere, and not just in the US, it doesn't necessarily mean that we should abandon who we are and where we're coming from. I think one specific aspect of where we stand is that we don't really realize how much we have in terms of intellectual, scientific, moral, I even dare to use the word, if not spiritual potential. So I think we should take stock of that we have something that still appeals. And second, there's the feeling that we cannot do it anymore. We realize that growth is not there anymore. We have obvious issues of outdated infrastructure, whether it's transportation, whether it's digital infrastructure across Europe. I mean, I know the UK feels that it's the worst in the club. It is not. Germany is by far not any better. France has done its best, but it's not where it should be. So there are many other examples in Europe of economically potent countries that are struggling with the same issues. But that does not mean it's the end of the road. I was in a pub actually here around the corner a few weeks ago, and it said, our country is done, but life is so nice. The pub, as you know, it's socially wonderful because you can just storm in the other's discussion, and then it becomes a larger discussion. What makes you think your country is done? I mean, this is such an un-British attitude. What has defined you is never to consider that today will be worse than tomorrow will be worse than today. On the contrary. And so I think politically what I find worrying but also fascinating is that inability of leadership to convince people, not persuade them with emotions, but convince them with facts that the better is yet to come because of the potential we have, as I said, in innovation, in science, in culture. And there is this moment, and it's Europe's moment when it comes to this.
That's interesting. That sort of throws up two questions in my mind. One is, where is that leadership going to come from, first of all? And secondly, in the essay, you make very clear that Europe has to convince its own population before it can go out with its sort of new offer
Yeah,
to the world.
yeah, absolutely. I think this is vital. I think we live in a fundamentally um, different age than everything before. By everything, I mean that geopolitically, this is a new chapter. Why? Because never in history had domestic and foreign policies, or domestic politics to be precise, and foreign policy been so closely, vitally intertwined. And for anyone who studied political sciences at university, the game is always more or less at some point. Can you name one political leader who has a brilliant track record both domestically and on foreign policy? You will not find many. I have one or two in mind, but it's almost impossible. These days, it's necessary. You will not be able to deliver domestically if you do not take stock of what's going on outside, and you will not be able to project any geopolitical consistency and even more so relevance if you do not address your mess at home. And in a way, it should draw a line of optimism, because it's also a question of having people feeling that they have a role to play in the grand future of the nation. It sounds very grand, I know, but there's no shame in saying, I believe in the man who sweeps the streets every day, because that person has a role that is actually equally important as yours, as mine, in building the greatness of that country. Whether you're in Britain, in Denmark, in Germany, it has nothing to do with a specific kind of country. I'm not falling into some sort of nationalism, but pride in what you do and understanding the purpose of what you do is crucial.
In terms of addressing it, and I'm not asking you to sort of pinpoint a particular party or leader, but do you see any signs of the sort of necessary political leadership that might show a direction this way?
I always sound very gloomy, and I wouldn't want to say I see no one. I don't see many. But if there were at least one voice, I guess that it would be the Pope. Popes generally have always had that approach to look at Europe from a cultural, spiritual, social standpoint, but they were not speaking to Europe only. They're heads of state, and the church is universal, so everyone around the world. But that specific Pope, because he's not European, because he has an understanding of the Latin culture, he's also Peruvian, he spent time in Peru, because obviously he's American, and has traveled so much around the world. The fact that, and in this regard, the speeches he gave in Cameroon, the extraordinary speeches he held in Spain at the Cortes were quite remarkable, because it sent a clear message to elected officials and Spaniards alike that there was every reason to believe in the goodness of your country, and not just the greatness, but the goodness, the fact that you can do not just the right thing, but do it right. And I think that mattered. It sounded so banal, say it's true, but why doesn't any politician say it? So that people say, yeah, I mean, it's not, it's the situation at the moment is not ideal economically, the geopolitical challenge. But I have this in me.
It's fascinating that you raise the Pope and his spiritual address to the world. Of course, very senior figures in the current Trump administration have addressed what they see as spiritual, civilizational decline in Europe. But you, in your essay, say rather to the contrary, that Europe has much to offer in terms of its civilization and its history and its culture.
Europe is like faith. When you have it, nothing can shake it. I have faith in Europe. So everything that's been happening for the past 20 years, from terrorism becoming embedded in our in our daily life. You know,
Mhm.
you're used to seeing the military and airport and train stations. So anyway, from terrorism, 25 years ago, to the financial crisis that has weakened Europe significantly, and in some respect, we haven't really fully recovered from that financial crisis nearly 20 years ago. Of course, the migration crisis that still bears scars today, and now the kind of split between the US and Europe. All of that doesn't make up for a very ideal moment for Europeans. And yet there is so much strength. I feel it like Mary Poppins' bag. It doesn't have a bottom. And we shouldn't be afraid of, going deep in the bag. And you realize that there are things you didn't know there were. And I think it is important. But to your point on the civilization, I mean, who can be the judge of a person's or a continent's spirituality? Certainly not Donald Trump or J.D. Vance. Not even the Pope to some respect, but he doesn't have that arrogance. We can look at religiosity, perhaps, and even on that point, it's going up again, especially amongst the younger generation. Not just in the Catholic faith, but many others, but especially if their issue is Christian Europe, Christianity is back looking at the number of baptisms. So that's already is wrong from on the US side. The second is spirituality. Spirituality is not just going to the church on Sunday. It's much deeper than that. When I look at the level of the intensity of charities in the UK or across Europe, but it's especially strong in the UK,
Mhm.
the question of community engagement, it's extraordinary. I mean, it shows that the question of injustice, indifference, inequality is being addressed by ordinary citizens. What is that if not spirituality? It's not the whole of the concept, of course, but it's a good pillar, a good part of it. And I think politics should take stock of that and somehow build on that, because it means that you have a favorable earth or ground within society to grow a bigger project for the future.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about how Europe can renew its offer to the world in spiritual and cultural terms, because in the essay, you refer very strikingly to W.B. Yeats in his great poem, The Second Coming, specifically the lines, "Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world." The phrase you settle on is the open centre. I wonder if you could explain to us what you mean by that.
I've always loved that line because the question of the center cannot hold, and Joan Didion also wrote about it. So it's something that is not new. But I think that will sound very old-fashioned European. Europe can still think itself as a center. It doesn't mean you don't have other centers. So I think it's a humble approach to centrism in a way, or
Mhm.
centric view of the world. But it has to be inclusive. So the center to hold has to be self-confident, know where it's going. I would not say a new golden age, but there could be a new age um, of creativity, innovation, prosperity that might not go with a 10% annual growth rate, but that can still provide everyone with a sense of purpose in very different aspects of life. Open because we will die if we're not inclusive of other ideas, other talents, other ways of thinking. And it would also make us look different from how many across the world, and especially the so-called global south, still see Europe saying, yeah, it's a one-way street. You pretend you're open-minded, but you're not.
Mm.
You're only interested in people if they think along your own lines. So it has to be open. And but that doesn't mean that it's no border or no limit to what makes us European in terms of rules, in terms of culture, in terms of um, of moral guidelines in a way. But we're also mindful of cultural differences, and we want to be appealing.
And
And
also,
to
I
be
think for
appealing, we need to make others feel like they have something to enrich. And it's all, if you look at all the
yes,
writers, I mean, all of the writers I mean, I could have named many others, but My country, for instance, France, if I look at Chagall, Picasso, just to take the painters, I could look at writers coming from Spain, Romania, Russia. I mean, all of that is a testimony of how important it is to be open. And those artists integrated in that kind of European intellectual and artistic matrix, but they unleashed their creativity.
You write in the essay that the political, demographic, economic centre of gravity is moving south, it's moving east. You recall S. Jaishankar, the Indian foreign minister's pointed words that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. I wonder if you can reflect upon whether Europe's offer is enough to bring together that coalition that you hope might form.
I believe there can be strong voices in countries that have a certain political weight in Europe who could, join forces together and embody that kind of offer to the world. But I don't expect kind of 28 countries saying, yeah, that's our proposal to the world. It won't happen that way. But to be appealing, it needs to be inclusive. What does that mean? It means that every country in the so-called global south is proud of its new right of being able not to choose between different geopolitical actors. They want to be able to deal with China and the US and Europe at the same time and not being lectured for doing so. And they are right, because it is how things should happen and we should respect that. And just because there are challenges with China, we see them, as the Germans call them, strategic competitors, and it doesn't mean that we cannot join forces where we can. So, compete and deter where we must, but cooperate where we can. I think that should be the mantra if we want our offer to be credible, because it means that sitting at Europe's table does not mean that you will need to take your contact book and delete some names. And I've met many scientists, professors, academics from Northern African countries, from Asian countries saying we don't even have a visa anymore. We don't feel like, it's not just we don't feel we're welcome, but we feel like there's not even any interest in building some form of dialogue. I think it's not the right way of showing that the center wants to grow by being inclusive and therefore open. I mean, the center cannot grow if it is not open. And if Europe in this sense does not grow, and not just from an economic perspective, we will gently fade away.
Next year, again, as you point out in your essay, we have some big elections. We have the French presidential election. Poland has another election. Others, no doubt. Why is that important, not just for those countries, but for Europe and for perhaps what you're discussing here today?
I think it's vital because it would provide an opportunity for having a real discussion about why are we so pessimistic when in all honesty and rationality there are solutions, there are remedies to address our problems. But this is only possible if you show that yes, we might need to work more. Yes, we might need to pay more taxes, at least some parts of society. But this is the horizon. This is why we need to make those efforts. The problem is, either you have demagogy and populism saying, we don't need to make any efforts, it's fine, we'll just come back where we were 50 years ago. Fine, that's the way of doing things, and you're doomed to disappoint your voters, but okay. The second is to say nothing. That's also the very likely option these days. The third is to say, I'll take risks. I'll be the Winston Churchill, I have nothing to offer but blood, tears, and sweat. But I explain why we need to accept some form of blood, tears, and sweat. People want to know what they're paying for, and I think that is where that narrative matters. And the second thing is, I'm very much aware that foreign policy is doesn't matter at all these days. It's certainly not in the public discussion. I had a discussion with conversation a few weeks ago with a very senior French politician who will be involved in the campaign and who said foreign policy will not matter in that election. It's a vote loser. So that kind of cynical approach to foreign policy shows that there is no understanding of the interconnectedness between domestic politics and foreign policy. How can you talk about sovereignty in energy or in the cloud if you don't talk about supply chains, reliance on dependency and reliance on China, on the US? And impossible. So that essay is a very, 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 very modest way of saying, raising a flag saying, you might think foreign policy is a vote loser, but it could actually be an opportunity to rebuild trust, to show that, there is something we can project to the world. And I think it's quite enthralling if you look at it that way.
Well, thank you so much, Grégoire, for discussing just some of the elements in your essay in the world today, in the summer issue, which I recommend to everybody to read. Gosh, I wish there was just more poetry discussed at Chatham House.
So would I. So would I. We should have more pictures of poets. And